It was early morning, just before sunrise, when the first light of dawn began to stretch across the horizon, casting a muted glow over the sleepy suburban streets. The air was crisp and still, the kind of quiet that only existed in the moments before the world truly woke up. In the distance, birds were beginning to stir, their soft chirps the only sign of life in the calmness that enveloped the neighborhood. The streets, lined with neatly trimmed lawns and houses that spoke of middle-class stability, stood silent, bathed in the pale blue light of the early hour. Vanessa James, a woman in her early 30s, jogged down one of these quiet streets, her steady footsteps softly echoing in the stillness. She was dressed in sleek, functional running gear, black leggings, and a matching athletic top that fit her toned figure perfectly. Her hair, tied back in a tight ponytail, bounced slightly with each step. The early morning runs had become part of her ritual, a way to center herself before the chaos of the day unfolded. To any observer, she was just another runner, a determined woman getting in her morning exercise before the city awakened. But there was far more to Vanessa than met the eye. Vanessa was no ordinary woman. She was a self-made success story, a thriving entrepreneur who owned several high-end restaurants in the city. Her journey to the top had not been easy, especially as a black woman navigating industries often dominated by white men. But Vanessa had never been one to back down from a challenge. She had fought for everything she had, clawing her way to the top with nothing but grit, determination, and an unshakable belief in herself. And yet, despite all her success, despite her achievements, she knew better than most that being black in America meant that none of it guaranteed her safety or respect. As she ran, her mind drifted to the day ahead. Her schedule was packed with meetings, tastings, and staff check-ins at her newest restaurant. But first, she was looking forward to a phone call with her brother, Derek James, who just so happened to be the chief of police in the city. Their bond had always been strong, forged in childhood and strengthened through shared experiences of overcoming adversity. Derek was not just her older brother but her rock, the one person she could always count on, no matter what. He had risen through the ranks of the police force with the same determination she had shown in her business endeavors, and now he was one of the most respected law enforcement officers in the city. The thought of Derek brought a smile to Vanessa's face. She hadn't spoken to him in a few days, both of them being busy with their demanding careers, but she knew he'd be calling soon, probably to check in on her like he always did. They had planned to meet for dinner later in the week, something they tried to do regularly despite their hectic lives. It was their way of staying connected, of making sure that no matter how much life pulled them in different directions, family always came first. Vanessa turned a corner, her pace steady, her breathing controlled. She loved this time of day, the cool air, the quiet streets, the feeling of being alone with her thoughts. There was something peaceful about it, something that allowed her to reset before the madness of the day took over. But this morning there was a slight tension in the air, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She brushed it off, attributing it to the stress of her upcoming meetings. As she continued running, she noticed a police car slowly turning onto the street behind her. At first, she didn't think much of it. Police cars patrolling the neighborhood weren't uncommon, especially in the early morning hours. But something about the way this car was moving, the slow, deliberate pace, made her uneasy. She glanced over her shoulder and saw that the car had begun to follow her, keeping a steady distance but unmistakably trailing her route. Vanessa's heart rate quickened, not from the run, but from a rising sense of unease. She knew the statistics, the stories black men and women stopped for no reason other than the color of their skin. She had heard them all, and though she had never experienced it personally, she knew the day might come. As a successful businesswoman, She had always tried to remain under the radar, driving modest cars, keeping her appearance professional yet low-key. But there were moments like this one where her gut told her that her success and status wouldn't matter. The police car crept closer. She could feel its presence now, the weight of its attention pressing on her back. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was she about to be stopped? Questioned? Arrested for simply running in her own neighborhood? She glanced down at her watch. It was barely 6:30 a.m. What could they possibly want with her? As if on cue, the patrol car's lights flickered on, casting a sudden, harsh red and blue glow across the quiet street. The sound of the siren broke the early morning stillness, its wail echoing off the nearby houses. Vanessa stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. She had done nothing wrong, but she knew how these things could go. She had read too many stories, seen too many headlines. She stood still, hands on her hips, catching her breath as the police car pulled up beside her. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Officer Brad Mills. He was in his mid-30s, with a clean-cut appearance that belied the ugliness inside him. He had been with the force for nearly a decade, but his career had stagnated. Frustrated with his lack of advancement and embittered by his personal failures, Mills had become someone who found fault in everyone but himself. He was known among his colleagues for his aggressive tactics, especially when it came to patrolling neighborhoods where he thought people didn't belong. Mills approached Vanessa with a look of disdain. He didn't see a successful businesswoman, a local figure of respect. All he saw was a black woman out early in a nice neighborhood, and to him, that was enough reason to stop her. "Morning," he said curtly, his hand resting on his belt where his holstered gun sat. The tension was palpable in the air, a thinly veiled threat beneath the surface of his words. Vanessa met his gaze, her eyes calm but alert. She wasn't intimidated, but she wasn't naive either. She knew the danger of these encounters, how quickly they could escalate. "Is there something I can help you with, officer?" she asked, keeping her tone polite but firm. Mills narrowed his eyes. "You live around here?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. He didn't wait for her to respond before continuing. "This area's had a few break-ins recently. You seem out of place." Out of place. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Vanessa had heard them before, in different forms from different people. It was the polite way of saying, "You don't belong here," but she did belong. She had worked hard for everything she had, and no one, especially not some small-minded cop, was going to tell her otherwise. "I live just a few blocks away," she said evenly, still maintaining her composure. "I'm out for my morning run." Mills took a step closer, clearly unsatisfied with her answer. He wasn't looking for an explanation, he was looking for an excuse. His hand tightened around the handle of his gun, a subtle reminder of the power he wielded. "You got ID on you." Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't brought her wallet, why would she? It was just a morning run. But she knew how this could look, how quickly the situation could spiral out of control. Still, she remained calm. "No, I don't have ID on me," she said, her voice steady. "But like I said, I live just a few blocks away." Mills smirked, the kind of smirk that said he had already made up his mind about her. Right, a few blocks away. Vanessa felt her patience thinning, but she kept her emotions in check. She wasn't about to give him a reason to escalate this further. She knew her brother would be calling any minute now, and just the thought of that gave her a sense of reassurance. But Mills didn't care who she was. To him, she was just another suspect, another potential arrest, another black person in a place where he thought they didn't belong. Officer Brad Mills stood a few feet away from Vanessa, his posture rigid, his hand still resting lightly on the holster of his gun. The smirk on his face was enough to make Vanessa's stomach twist with discomfort, though she didn't let it show. She knew this game all too well, the one where the person in power, especially when that person was a white cop, would try to use intimidation to get what they wanted. She had seen it time and again, both in her own life and in the countless stories of black men and women across the country who had been subjected to the same treatment. But there was something about this particular moment that made it feel even more charged. Maybe it was the early hour or the quiet stillness of the neighborhood that made every movement, every word, seem amplified. Or maybe it was the fact that Mills didn't seem like he was going to back down, no matter what she said. His demeanor made it clear that he had already decided who she was and why she was there, and nothing she said would change his mind. Vanessa had dealt with ignorant people before. In her business, she'd faced down clients and investors who had underestimated her or treated her differently because of her race. She had always handled those situations with grace, refusing to let anyone reduce her to a stereotype. But there was something about the way Mills looked at her, like she was less than human, like she was a problem that needed to be dealt with, that made her blood run cold. She took a breath, trying to maintain her composure. "Officer," she said again, her voice calm but firmer this time, "I've told you where I live, and I've told you what I'm doing here. I don't have my ID on me because I'm just out for a run. If there's something else you need, I'd appreciate it if you let me know." Mills didn't move. His eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, closing the gap between them until they were just a few feet apart. His smirk had faded, replaced by a hard, calculating stare. Vanessa could feel the tension in the air thickening, pressing down on her like a weight. She resisted the urge to step back, knowing that any sign of weakness or fear could give him the excuse he was looking for to escalate the situation. "You know," Mills began, his voice low and dripping with condescension, "you don't exactly fit in around here. People who live in this neighborhood don't usually look like you." There it was. The thinly veiled racism, cloaked in a casual, almost dismissive tone, but carrying the weight of centuries of oppression. Vanessa's jaw tightened, but she didn't bite. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattle, of watching her lose her cool. That was exactly what he wanted to provoke her, to make her lash out so that he could justify whatever it was he planned to do next. "I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean," Vanessa replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "But like I said, I live just a few blocks from here, and I'm out for my morning run. There's nothing suspicious about that." Mill's hand tightened around his holster again, his fingers tapping lightly on the leather as if he were considering drawing it. Vanessa felt a flicker of unease in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She wasn't going to let him see her fear. "Maybe you don't understand how this works," Mills said, his tone growing more aggressive. "When I ask for ID, you give me ID. If you don't have it, then I have the right to detain you until I figure out who you are and what you're doing here." Vanessa's pulse quickened. She knew her rights, she wasn't under arrest, and she hadn't done anything wrong. But she also knew that in situations like this, knowing your rights didn't always matter. All it took was one wrong move, one wrong word, and things could spiral out of control. "I'm not refusing to cooperate," she said carefully, choosing her words with precision. "I'm just telling you that I don't have my ID because I wasn't expecting to need it while jogging in my own neighborhood. If you need proof of who I am, I can call my brother. He's the chief of police." For the briefest of moments, something flickered across Mill's face, surprise maybe, or doubt. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced once again by that cold, hard look of disdain. He didn't believe her. He didn't want to believe her. In his mind, she was already guilty of something, and he wasn't going to let her talk her way out of it. "Your brother's the chief of police," Mills sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's rich. What, you think dropping some name is going to get you out of this?" Vanessa felt her frustration growing. She had hoped that mentioning Derek's name would put an end to this ridiculous situation, that Mills would realize he was about to make a huge mistake and back off. But instead, it only seemed to fuel his arrogance. He was doubling down, determined to prove his authority, no matter how unfounded it was. "I don't care who you claim your brother is," Mills continued, stepping even closer until he was towering over her. "Right now, I'm the one asking the questions, and you're the one who needs to answer them. So either you start cooperating, or I'm going to take you down to the station, and we'll sort this out there." Vanessa's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the situation spiraling, feel the dangerous edge that Mills was teetering on. She had been careful, calm, and respectful, but none of that seemed to matter. He had already decided that she was a threat, that she was guilty of something, and he was looking for any excuse to escalate this into an arrest. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Not today. "I'm not going to the station," Vanessa said firmly, crossing her arms over her chest. "I haven't done anything wrong, and you don't have any reason to detain me. If you're really that concerned, I can call my brother right now, and he'll clear this up." Mills' face twisted with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Vanessa. In his world, people complied without question. They didn't push back. They didn't stand their ground. And they certainly didn't threaten to bring in their high-ranking relatives to undermine his authority. But Vanessa wasn't backing down, and that only made Mills more determined to assert his power. Without warning, he lunged forward, grabbing Vanessa by the arm and yanking her toward his patrol car. The suddenness of the movement took her by surprise, and for a moment, she stumbled, trying to regain her footing. But Mills didn't let up. His grip on her arm was tight, almost painful, as he dragged her toward the car with an air of triumphant authority. "Let go of me," Vanessa shouted, her voice finally breaking the calm exterior she had maintained up until this point. She struggled against his grip, trying to free herself, but he was stronger than she had anticipated. The calm, quiet morning had suddenly turned chaotic, the peaceful stillness of the neighborhood shattered by the sound of her raised voice and the harsh grip of Mills' hand on her arm. Mills shoved her up against the side of his patrol car, his hand still clutching her arm with a vice-like grip. His face was flushed with anger, his breathing heavy as he stared down at her with a look of pure disdain. He was beyond reason now, caught up in his own power trip, blinded by his need to control the situation. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You think just because you've got some fancy brother in the police force, you're untouchable? Well, let me tell you something, no one is untouchable." Vanessa's mind was racing, adrenaline surging through her veins. She had never been in a situation like this before, where she felt so powerless, so vulnerable. But even in her panic, she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let him win. Not like this. "You're making a huge mistake," she managed to say through gritted teeth. "My brother will hear about this, and when he does, you'll regret every second of it." Mills just laughed, a cold, bitter sound that sent a chill down Vanessa's spine. "Your brother," he scoffed. "Your brother isn't here to help you now, and by the time he finds out, it'll be too late." For a moment, the two of them stood frozen in place, Vanessa pinned against the car, Mills looming over her like a predator about to strike. The tension was so thick, it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. And then, Just as Mills was about to speak again, a sudden roar filled the air, the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine revving as it sped down the street toward them. Vanessa's heart leapt in her chest. She knew that sound. She knew it better than anyone. It was Derek. The roar of the motorcycle engine cut through the air like a jagged knife, loud and powerful, echoing off the suburban houses that lined the street. It was a sound that, to Vanessa, brought an unexpected wave of relief, a lifeline thrown in the middle of what had quickly spiraled into a dangerous situation. She knew that sound intimately. It was her brother's Harley-Davidson, and it was unmistakable. Officer Brad Mills, however, didn't register it the same way. His grip on Vanessa's arm remained firm, his mind too focused on asserting control to understand the gravity of what was happening. The noise barely fazed him as he tightened his hold, preparing to force her into the back of the squad car. He was determined to arrest her, to drag her to the station, and make her pay for the perceived slight against his authority. Vanessa tried to pull her arm free, but Mills' grip was unyielding. He was clearly stronger than her, but she wasn't going to go down without a fight. "I told you," she hissed through clenched teeth. "You're making a mistake." Mills' smirk returned as he leaned in closer. "I don't think I am," he replied, his voice dripping with arrogance. His breath was hot against her ear, a reminder that he believed he had all the power in this situation. "You think I'm scared of some name you dropped? Let's see how tough your brother is when you're sitting in a cell." But as the motorcycle drew nearer, its engine a rumbling threat in the distance, Mills finally turned his head. He squinted into the early morning light, trying to make out the figure approaching at high speed. His smirk faltered for a split second, replaced by confusion. He hadn't expected anyone else to be around at this hour, certainly not someone who looked like they were barreling toward him with purpose. The motorcycle skidded to a stop just a few feet away from them, the rider's booted foot slamming down onto the pavement to balance the heavy bike. The engine cut out abruptly, leaving an almost eerie silence in its wake, broken only by the rhythmic thud of Mills' heartbeat pounding in his ears. Whoever this was, they had arrived with intent. The rider removed his helmet, revealing Derek James, his face etched with stone-cold determination. His eyes locked onto Mills immediately, the expression in them one of pure, controlled rage. Mills, still holding Vanessa, didn't fully comprehend what was happening yet, but Derek's presence commanded attention. His presence was undeniable, tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating authority. For Vanessa, Derek's appearance felt like a storm breaking over the horizon. Relief and tension warred within her, knowing that her brother was here now, but also understanding that the situation was about to take a very serious turn. Derek didn't say anything at first. He simply dismounted the bike with a slow, deliberate motion, letting the weight of his silence hang in the air like a threat. Every step he took toward them was measured, controlled, as if he were keeping a tight leash on the anger boiling just beneath the surface. Mills, oblivious to who Derek was, saw only a man coming toward him with a purposeful stride, and his instincts as a cop kicked in. Mills, still clutching Vanessa's arm, called out, "Sir, I need you to step back. This is a police matter." Derek didn't stop. His eyes never left Mills, cold and calculating as he assessed the situation. Mills, interpreting Derek's lack of response as a challenge, squared his shoulders and tightened his grip on Vanessa, as if to assert his control over her even more. "I said, back off," Mills repeated, his voice louder now, tinged with the authority he was desperately trying to cling to. He was used to people listening when he barked commands, used to them backing down when he projected his authority. But Derek was no ordinary person. Vanessa, still pinned against the patrol car, turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Derek's for a brief moment. In that instant, she could see that her brother was beyond furious. He wasn't just angry at the situation, he was enraged by the injustice of it, by the fact that his own sister had been manhandled by a cop who didn't even bother to check who she was. But as always, Derek's anger was a cold, controlled fire. He never let it consume him. Not yet. Without breaking his gaze, Derek spoke, his voice low and deadly calm. "Let go of her." Mills hesitated, his eyes darting between Vanessa and Derek. There was something about the man's tone that unnerved him, though he couldn't quite place it. It wasn't just a demand, it was a promise, a threat. But Mills wasn't the kind of man who backed down easily, especially not in front of someone he perceived as a threat to his authority. He puffed out his chest slightly, trying to assert his dominance. "Sir," Mills said, his voice strained as he tried to maintain his composure, "I'm going to need you to leave. This woman is being detained for questioning, and if you interfere, I'll have no choice but to arrest you for obstruction." Derek's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them until he was standing directly in front of Mills. The tension between them was palpable, crackling in the air like static electricity. Vanessa could feel it, the way her brother's presence seemed to fill the space around them, suffocating the weak grip Mills had on the situation. "I said," Derek repeated, his voice still dangerously calm, "let go of her." Mills' bravado began to falter. There was something in Derek's eyes that chilled him to the bone, something that made him realize, far too late, that he was out of his depth. He glanced at Vanessa, who remained silent but unwavering, and then back at Derek, who was now close enough that Mills could see the rage simmering just beneath the surface of his calm exterior. And then finally, it clicked. This was the brother. The brother. Derek James, the police chief. For a split second, Mills' face paled. He had heard the name before, of course, who in the force hadn't? Derek James was something of a legend in the department, known not just for his skill and intelligence, but for his unflinching sense of justice. He was the kind of cop who had a reputation for cleaning house, for rooting out corruption, and for standing up to anyone who thought they were above the law. And here he was, standing inches away from Mills, looking like he was seconds away from tearing him apart. Mills' grip on Vanessa loosened involuntarily as panic began to set in. He had no idea what to do next. He had backed himself into a corner, and now there was no easy way out. He couldn't just let her go, that would be an admission that he had made a mistake. But if he didn't, he knew things were about to get a lot worse for him. Vanessa, sensing the shift in power, didn't move. She knew that Derek had this under control now, but she also knew that one wrong move from Mills could escalate things in an instant. "You're Derek James," Mills finally muttered, the realization dawning on him too late. Derek didn't respond. He didn't need to. His reputation had spoken for him, and now the only thing left was for Mills to make his decision. Would he let go of his fragile sense of authority and walk away, or would he continue down the path he'd chosen, digging himself deeper into a hole he wouldn't be able to climb out of? For a moment it seemed like Mills was going to back down. His hand slid away from Vanessa's arm, his posture stiff and awkward, as if he were weighing his options. But then something in his eyes shifted. It wasn't resignation, it was desperation. Mills wasn't the kind of man who could handle humiliation, and in this moment, Derek's presence alone was enough to humiliate him. Without warning, Mills lunged forward, his hand moving toward his gun in a panicked, desperate motion. The world seemed to slow for a heartbeat as Vanessa's eyes widened in shock, her body tensing in anticipation of what was about to happen. But Derek was faster. Before Mills could even touch his holster, Derek moved with the precision and speed of a trained officer. In one swift motion, he grabbed Mills' arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing the smaller man to his knees with a fluidity that spoke to years of experience. Mills cried out in pain as Derek wrenched his arm into an unnatural position, his free hand reaching up to disarm him in one quick motion. The gun was out of its holster and in Derek's hand before Mills even realized what had happened. Derek tossed it aside without a second thought, his grip on Mills' arm still tight enough to make the other man wince. "You think you can draw on me," Derek growled, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with enough menace to make Mills tremble. "You think you can just pull your weapon on someone because you're scared? You're pathetic." Mills struggled weakly against Derek's hold, but it was useless. He was completely at the mercy of a man who had no patience left for him, no mercy to spare. Vanessa watched in silence, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen her brother like this, not in action, not like this. He had always been the calm one, the rational one, but now he was a force of nature, his anger and sense of justice fueling every move he made. Derek leaned in closer to Mills, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't belong in that uniform," he hissed. "You don't deserve the badge you wear. You think this is how you uphold the law? By bullying innocent people? By treating them like criminals because of the color of their skin?" Mills didn't respond. He couldn't. His face was contorted in pain and fear, his entire body shaking as he realized just how badly he had screwed up. This wasn't just an angry citizen or a harmless civilian he could intimidate. This was the police chief, and worse, it was the police chief's sister he had just assaulted. Derek released Mills' arm, shoving him roughly onto the ground. Mills scrambled to his feet, cradling his injured arm and looking up at Derek with wide, terrified eyes. He looked like a cornered animal, desperate and panicked. Derek stood over him, his expression cold and unyielding. "You're done," he said simply, his voice calm again, but no less terrifying. "Get in your car. Drive back to the station. Turn in your badge and your gun. You're not fit to wear either of them." Mills hesitated, his pride warring with his survival instincts. But he knew better than to argue now. He had lost, and there was no coming back from this. Silently, he turned and staggered toward his patrol car, his face pale and drawn, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Derek didn't watch him go. He turned to Vanessa instead, his expression softening as he reached out to place a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with concern. Vanessa nodded, though her heart was still racing. "Yeah," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Thanks to you." Derek offered her a small, reassuring smile. "Let's get you home," he said, glancing back at the patrol car as it slowly pulled away, Mills' figure slumped behind the wheel. "This isn't over yet." As Officer Mills' patrol car disappeared down the street, leaving only the distant hum of its engine in the air, Vanessa and Derek stood together in the cool morning light, the quiet around them almost surreal after the intensity of what had just unfolded. The tension that had filled the street only moments ago was still palpable, but it had been replaced by a sense of uneasy calm. Vanessa could feel the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, her pulse quick and sharp, but she forced herself to take a deep breath, to regain control of her racing thoughts. Derek, still standing beside her, glanced in the direction where Mills' car had gone. His jaw was set, and his eyes were narrowed in the way they always were, when he was deep in thought, calculating his next move. Vanessa had seen this look before, but usually it was reserved for moments when he was dealing with high-stakes cases that required him to balance the letter of the law with his own personal sense of justice. She knew what was coming next, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. Derek was going to have to deal with this mess at the station. Mills had crossed a line, and not just with her as his sister, but with his position as a police officer. The humiliation and loss of control he had just experienced would likely lead to an even bigger confrontation once he returned to the precinct. And despite Derek's power and authority as the chief, she knew the complexities of these situations all too well. There were always politics at play, always unseen forces working behind the scenes, especially when it came to race and the police. Vanessa, Derek's voice broke into her thoughts, soft but firm, pulling her attention back to the present. He was watching her carefully, concern etched across his face. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. I can't believe how fast that escalated." Derek sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's always like this," he muttered. "Doesn't matter how hard we try to make progress. There's always going to be guys like Mills who think they're above it all, who think they can act on their prejudices without consequences." Vanessa swallowed the lump in her throat. "He didn't even care who I was," she said quietly. "I told him I was your sister, and he didn't even blink. He was so caught up in his own arrogance, in his own hatred, that nothing else mattered." Derek's expression darkened. He hated this. Hated that his sister, his blood, had been treated like this, right under his nose. It wasn't the first time he'd seen racial bias play out in his department, but it hit differently when it was someone so close to him. Someone he had sworn to protect, not just as a brother but as a law enforcement officer. "We'll deal with him," Derek said, his tone resolute. "But right now I need you to be honest with me. Are you okay? I know that must have been terrifying." Vanessa exhaled slowly, her shoulders finally beginning to relax as the reality of the situation set in. "I'm okay," she said after a beat. "I mean, it was scary, but I didn't feel powerless. I knew you'd come." Derek's gaze softened. "You know I'll always have your back," he said quietly. "But I shouldn't have had to. You shouldn't have had to go through that, V, not ever." She nodded, a lump forming in her throat again, this time from the overwhelming sense of love and protection she felt from her brother. Despite everything, despite the terror of the moment, she knew she could always count on Derek. That was something no one, not even someone as arrogant as Mills, could take away from her. "Come on," Derek said after a moment, nodding toward the sidewalk. "I'll walk you back home. We need to talk about what happens next." Vanessa hesitated. She knew what he was getting at. What happened next wouldn't just be a family matter. It was going to be something much bigger, something that would likely ripple through the entire police department, if not the community itself. She wasn't naive enough to think that Mills would just accept what had happened and move on. Men like him didn't back down easily, and she had no doubt that he was already plotting his next move. But Derek wouldn't let that happen. She trusted him implicitly, not just because he was her brother, but because he was a man of integrity. As they started walking, the tension between them began to ease, though the weight of what had just happened still hung in the air. The street was quiet now, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the early morning breeze. It felt almost surreal, like the calm after a storm. But Vanessa knew better. This wasn't over. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the crisp morning air refreshing after the stifling tension of the confrontation with Mills. As they approached her block, Derek finally spoke again. "We need to be prepared," he said, his tone serious. "Mills isn't going to take this lying down. He's going to make trouble at the station. He's going to try to spin this, make it look like you were resisting arrest or being uncooperative. You know how guys like him operate." Vanessa frowned. She knew exactly what Derek was talking about. She had seen it before: police officers who twisted the truth to protect themselves, who made up stories to justify their actions when they knew they were in the wrong. It was one of the many reasons she had never fully trusted the system, despite Derek's position within it. No matter how much progress had been made, there were always those who believed they were above the law. "But there were no witnesses," Vanessa said, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's just my word against his." Derek shook his head. "Doesn't matter. You're not just some random civilian, you're my sister, and that gives us leverage. Mills knows that now. He knows he screwed up, and trust me, I've got eyes and ears at the station. Whatever he tries to pull, we'll be ready for it." Vanessa felt a wave of relief wash over her. Derek always had a plan. He was always 3 steps ahead, no matter what the situation. It was one of the reasons he had risen so quickly through the ranks of the police force. He wasn't just a good cop, he was a strategic one. But even so, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger, something systemic. Mills was just one officer, but he represented a larger problem within the force, within society as a whole. And as much as Derek might be able to handle things on a personal level, she knew that the real battle would be much harder to win. They reached her house, a modest 2-story home with a well-kept front lawn and a small porch. Vanessa had bought it a few years ago after her business had started to take off, and it had quickly become her sanctuary. But as she stood there now, looking at the familiar surroundings, she couldn't shake the feeling that her safe haven had been violated. "Do you want to come in?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Derek shook his head. "I need to head to the station," he said. "I've got a few calls to make before I deal with Mills. But I'll come by later tonight. We need to figure out how we're going to handle this." Vanessa nodded, understanding. She didn't want to be alone right now, but she knew Derek had his job to do. And she trusted him to handle it. He always did. "Be careful," she said quietly, her voice filled with concern. Derek gave her a reassuring smile, though she could see the tension still lingering in his eyes. "I always am," he replied. "I'll see you tonight." As he turned to leave, Vanessa stood on the porch for a moment, watching him go. The morning light was brighter now, the sun fully risen and casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. But despite the calmness of the scene, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse before they got better. She turned and went inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The familiar smell of coffee greeted her as she stepped into the kitchen, the pot she had set to brew before her run now bubbling quietly on the counter. It was a small comfort in the midst of the chaos that had unfolded outside. But as she poured herself a cup, her mind was already racing, trying to figure out what the next steps would be. She couldn't let Mills get away with this, not just for her sake, but for the sake of every other person who had been treated the way she had. She wasn't the type to back down from a fight, and she wasn't going to start now. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before she dialed a familiar number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hey, Lisa," her best friend and lawyer, greeted her. "What's going on? You're calling me early." Vanessa didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need your help," she said, her voice steady. "Something happened this morning. I need to know what my options are." Lisa's tone immediately shifted to one of concern. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Vanessa replied, though the knot in her stomach said otherwise. "But there's an officer, Mills. He tried to arrest me for no reason. Derek showed up. But it's not over. I need to know how we can hold him accountable. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Lisa spoke again, her voice calm but firm. Okay. Let's figure this out. I'll meet you at your place in an hour. Vanessa exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had Derek, she had Lisa, and she wasn't going to let Mills, or anyone else, get away with treating her like she was less than human. As she hung up the phone and took a sip of her coffee, she felt a sense of resolve settle over her. This wasn't just about her. This was about justice, and she was ready to do whatever it took to make sure Mills paid for what he had done. The fight was just beginning. The warm scent of freshly brewed coffee did little to soothe Vanessa's nerves as she paced across her living room floor, phone still clutched in her hand. The calm she had managed to maintain earlier had long since evaporated, replaced by a steady undercurrent of anger and frustration. She could feel it building inside her, a quiet, simmering rage that threatened to spill over if she didn't keep herself in check. This wasn't over not by a long shot, and the more she thought about it, the more determined she became to make sure that Brad Mills faced consequences for what he had done. Outside, the sun was rising higher in the sky, casting soft light across the suburban street, where only an hour before, Mills had pinned her against his patrol car, trying to exert his power over her. The memory of his smug expression, the way his hand had tightened around her arm, still made her skin crawl. But what bothered her even more was the knowledge that this wasn't an isolated incident. Mills was just one cog in a much larger machine, a system that had been failing people like her for generations. She had never been someone to back down from a fight. Her whole life had been about overcoming obstacles, whether it was breaking into the restaurant business as a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated industry, or fighting to be taken seriously in every aspect of her life. She had worked hard to get to where she was, and she wasn't going to let some racist cop take that from her. But this fight was different. This was personal. Vanessa's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. She glanced at the clock. Exactly 1 hour had passed since she had called Lisa. True to her word, her best friend and trusted lawyer had arrived on time, ready to discuss the next steps. Vanessa opened the door, and Lisa walked in, her face set in a serious expression that told Vanessa she was ready for business. Lisa had always been the pragmatic one, the one who approached every problem with a level head and a clear sense of purpose. It was one of the reasons Vanessa had trusted her with every major legal decision she'd made in her career. And now, more than ever, she needed that sharp, analytical mind on her side. "Hey," Lisa greeted her, setting her briefcase down on the table. "You all right?" Vanessa nodded, though the tightness in her chest hadn't fully eased. "I will be," she said, motioning for Lisa to sit. "But we need to talk about what happened this morning. I'm not letting this slide." Lisa nodded, her expression unreadable as she flipped open her briefcase and pulled out a notebook. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling out a pen. "From the beginning." Vanessa sat down across from her, taking a deep breath before recounting the events of the morning. She started with her run, explaining how Mills had followed her in his patrol car, how he had immediately assumed she was out of place in her own neighborhood. As she spoke, the emotions she had been holding back began to surface: anger, frustration, humiliation. But she kept her voice steady, determined to get through the story without breaking down. Lisa listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes but mostly letting Vanessa speak uninterrupted. When Vanessa reached the part where Derek had arrived and confronted Mills, Lisa's eyebrows raised slightly, though she didn't say anything right away. She had known Derek for years and respected him immensely. but even she was surprised at how quickly things had escalated between him and Mills. When Vanessa finally finished, there was a brief silence as Lisa absorbed everything she had just heard. Vanessa could see the gears turning in her friend's mind, her lawyer instincts already calculating the best way to approach this situation. "Well," Lisa began, setting down her pen and leaning back in her chair, "this is definitely a mess. But you're right, you can't let this slide. Mills overstepped in a major way, and we have to hold him accountable. The question is how." Vanessa exhaled, relieved that Lisa was on the same page. "What are my options?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with the frustration she had been holding in. Lisa tapped her pen against the notebook thoughtfully. "There are a few ways we can go about this," she said slowly. "You could file a formal complaint with the department, but given that Derek's already involved, that might complicate things. Internal Affairs could investigate, but that process could take months, and honestly, Mills will probably do everything he can to discredit you in the meantime." Vanessa frowned. She had expected as much, but hearing it laid out so plainly only made her more frustrated. The system was designed to protect officers like Mills, and even with Derek's position as chief of police, she knew that Mills would try to manipulate the situation to his advantage. "What about a lawsuit?" Vanessa asked, her mind racing ahead to the possible legal routes she could take. "Can we take this to court?" Lisa considered the question for a moment. "You could file a civil suit for wrongful detainment or use of excessive force," she said carefully. "But again, that's a long process, and Mills will likely drag it out as much as possible. Not to mention the fact that the department will probably back him, at least at first. Even if Derek's on your side, there are a lot of people who won't be." Vanessa clenched her fists, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She had always known that this fight wouldn't be easy, but hearing Lisa lay out the realities of what she was up against made it feel even more daunting. "So what do we do?" Vanessa asked, her voice hardening. "I'm not going to let this guy get away with what he did. Not just for me, but for everyone else he's probably treated the same way." Lisa met her gaze, her expression serious. "We build a case," she said firmly. "We gather evidence, we document everything, and we make sure that Mills can't wriggle his way out of this. But more importantly, we need to make sure the department can't protect him." Vanessa nodded, feeling a spark of hope ignite within her. "What do you need from me?" Lisa leaned forward, her voice calm but determined. "I need you to write down everything you remember about this morning. Every detail, no matter how small. We're going to need as much documentation as possible if we're going to fight this. And I'll start looking into Mills' record, see if there's anything in his history that could help us." Vanessa's mind was already racing. "He mentioned something about break-ins in the neighborhood," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But I don't think that's true. I haven't heard of anything like that happening around here." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Interesting," she said. "If he was lying about that, it could be another strike against him. We'll look into it." Vanessa felt a renewed sense of purpose as she nodded, determined to see this through. "Okay," she said, "let's do this." But as they continued to talk, Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get even more complicated. Mills wasn't the type to back down easily, and she had no doubt that he was already preparing to retaliate. The thought made her stomach churn, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to be afraid. Not now. As Vanessa and Lisa worked through their strategy, across town, at the police precinct, Brad Mills was fuming. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he pulled into the parking lot, his mind racing with a combination of anger and humiliation. He had been publicly humiliated by Derek James, humiliated in front of the chief's sister, no less. The memory of being physically overpowered by Derek, of having his gun taken from him in front of Vanessa, played over and over in his mind like a broken record. The shame of it was suffocating, and the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. By the time he parked his patrol car and stormed into the precinct, his anger had reached a boiling point. He couldn't let this stand. He wasn't going to let Derek James destroy his career, especially not over some uppity woman who thought she could run her mouth just because her brother was the police chief. Mills slammed the door to his office behind him, pacing back and forth as he tried to figure out his next move. He knew he had to be careful. Derek James was powerful, and he had enough influence in the department to make things very difficult for Mills if he decided to press the issue. But Mills also knew that he wasn't without allies. There were people in the department who didn't particularly like Derek, people who thought he was too soft, too concerned with playing politics rather than enforcing the law. And if Mills could convince them that Derek was using his position to protect his sister, he might just be able to turn the tables. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in a while. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "Yeah." "It's Mills," he said, his voice tight with anger. "I need a favor." There was a pause on the other end of the line before the voice spoke again, this time with more interest. "What kind of favor?" Mills glanced around the room, making sure no one was nearby to overhear. "I need dirt on Derek James, something I can use to push back against him. He's trying to railroad me over a bullshit complaint, and I'm not going to let him get away with it." The man on the other end of the line chuckled darkly. "Derek James, huh? You're playing a dangerous game, Mills." Mills clenched his jaw, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. "I don't care. He's already crossed the line, and I'm not going to sit back and let him ruin me." There was another pause before the man spoke again, his voice low and calculating. "All right, I'll see what I can find. But you'd better be ready to deal with the consequences." Mill's lips curled into a grim smile. "Just get me what I need." As he hung up the phone, a sense of grim satisfaction settled over him. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Back at Vanessa's house, Lisa finished her notes and packed her things. "I'll start digging into Mill's record," she said, standing up and giving Vanessa a reassuring nod. "Don't worry, we'll get him." Vanessa nodded, though her mind was still racing. As Lisa left, she couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. Mills wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and she knew that the next few days or weeks were going to be a test of her strength and resilience. But she wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. As she stood by the window, watching the street outside, she felt a renewed sense of determination. Mills had made a mistake by coming after her, and now he was going to pay for it. Whatever it took. The next few days felt like a blur for Vanessa, a tense waiting game where every moment seemed fraught with anticipation. She went about her daily life, managing her restaurants, keeping up with her obligations, but there was a constant undercurrent of anxiety that she couldn't shake. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart would leap into her throat, fearing that it would be some new escalation from Mills or a call from Derek telling her that things had gotten worse. Lisa had been working tirelessly, gathering information, preparing legal documents, and digging into Mills' record. There was already some promising evidence, rumors of previous complaints against Mills for excessive force and racially motivated behavior, though nothing had ever stuck. Mills, it seemed, was the type to skirt consequences, protected by the thin blue line of his brothers in uniform who looked the other way when it came to his behavior. Vanessa was determined to make sure that wouldn't happen this time. She wasn't just another victim he could intimidate or manipulate. With Derek on her side and Lisa guiding her through the legal steps, she was prepared for whatever was coming next. But even with her support system in place, the uncertainty gnawed at her. The waiting, the not knowing, was the worst part. Then, late one afternoon, the call came. Vanessa was in her office, going over schedules for her staff, when her phone rang. It was Derek. The tone in his voice was enough to make her sit up straighter, tension gripping her instantly. "V, I need you to come down to the station," Derek said, his voice low and serious. "There's something going on here, and you need to see it for yourself." Vanessa's pulse quickened. "What's happening?" she asked, trying to keep the rising sense of dread out of her voice. "Mills," Derek said simply. "He's making moves, and it's bigger than I thought. I need you here now." Her stomach dropped. She had known Mills wouldn't go down quietly, but hearing Derek's concern sent a shiver down her spine. She grabbed her jacket and keys, her heart racing as she hurried out the door. Whatever Mills was planning, it was time to face it head-on. By the time Vanessa arrived at the police station, the air felt thick with tension. The building loomed large and intimidating, the hustle of officers moving in and out of the station taking on a different weight now that she was about to confront her enemy directly. Derek was waiting for her just inside, his expression grim. He didn't waste time with pleasantries as he led her down the hallway toward the back offices. "Things are heating up, V," he said quietly as they walked. "Mills isn't going to go down without a fight. He's already got a few of the other officers on his side, and he's trying to frame this as me using my position to protect you." Vanessa clenched her fists. "Of course he is," she muttered, anger rising in her chest. "That's exactly what I was afraid of." Derek stopped outside a door, turning to face her. "There's more," he said, his voice grim. "He's filed a formal complaint against me." Vanessa froze, her eyes widening in shock. "What? For what?" "For abuse of power," Derek replied, the bitterness in his tone unmistakable. "He's claiming that I assaulted him without provocation and that I'm using my influence to cover up your illegal behavior." Vanessa's mouth fell open, disbelief and fury surging through her. "That's ridiculous. He's the one who—" "I know," Derek interrupted, his voice calm but strained. "I know, V. But this is what he does. He's turning this into a power struggle. He's trying to make me look like the bad guy, and there are people in the department who are already starting to believe him." Vanessa's heart pounded in her chest. She had expected Mills to retaliate, but she hadn't anticipated that he would go this far. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Derek sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We fight," he said simply. "But it's not going to be easy. He's stirring up the worst kind of trouble, and I have to tread carefully. This is about more than just you and me now. It's about the department, the city, everything." Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. She had always known that this fight wasn't just personal, but hearing Derek say it so plainly made the weight of it hit her all at once. This wasn't just about one racist cop abusing his power, this was about the entire system that allowed people like Mills to thrive. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "What do you need me to do?" Derek looked at her, his eyes hard with determination. "You need to be prepared for whatever comes next. Mills is going to try to drag you into this even deeper, and he's going to try to paint you as a troublemaker. You need to be ready to defend yourself, and we need to be ready to take him down." Vanessa nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready." Derek's gaze softened for a moment, and he gave her a small nod. "Good. Let's go." Derek led her deeper into the station, past a group of officers who gave them sidelong glances as they passed. Vanessa could feel the tension in the air, the way some of them seemed to hesitate as Derek walked by, their loyalty to him wavering in the face of Mills' accusations. It made her stomach turn, but she kept her chin high, refusing to show any weakness. They reached a small conference room at the back of the station, where Lisa was already waiting. Her laptop was open in front of her, and she looked up as they entered, her expression serious but composed. "I've been doing some digging," Lisa said as soon as they sat down. "Mills has a lot more skeletons in his closet than we thought." Vanessa frowned. "What do you mean?" Lisa pulled up a file on her laptop, turning the screen toward them. "He's had multiple complaints filed against him over the years, allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, harassment. But every single time, the complaints were either dismissed or buried. He's been protected by higher-ups in the department. But I think we've got enough here to build a case against him." Vanessa leaned forward, her heart racing as she scanned the documents on the screen. There it was, in black and white, evidence of Mills' long history of misconduct, dating back years. He had terrorized countless people, using his badge as a shield to get away with it, and no one had ever held him accountable. Until now. "This is it," Vanessa said, her voice tight with emotion. "This is what we need." Lisa nodded. "It's a start. But we need more if we're going to take him down for good. I'm working on getting statements from some of the people who filed complaints against him, but it's going to take time. Mills has a lot of people scared." Vanessa's stomach churned with anger. They shouldn't have to be afraid. He should be the one who's afraid. Derek placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression grim. "We'll get him, V," he said quietly. "But we have to be smart about this. Mills is dangerous, and he's going to play dirty." "I don't care," Vanessa replied, her voice firm. "I'm not backing down." Lisa gave her a reassuring nod. "We won't let him win. But you need to be prepared for what's coming. Mills is going to throw everything he has at you and at Derek." Vanessa's chest tightened at the thought of Derek being dragged down by this. She had always known that Mills would come after her, but she hadn't fully grasped how deep his vendetta went. He wasn't just trying to ruin her, he was trying to destroy Derek's career, to tear down everything her brother had built. But as she sat there, staring at the evidence of Mills' corruption, something inside her shifted. The fear and uncertainty that had been gnawing at her for days began to fade, replaced by a fierce determination. Mills might have the system on his side, but she had something stronger: truth, justice, and people who believed in her. "I'm ready," Vanessa said again, her voice steady and resolute. Derek and Lisa exchanged a glance, both of them seeing the same fire in her eyes. The time for hesitation had passed. Now it was time to fight. The next day, the confrontation finally came to a head. Vanessa was in her office at the restaurant when her phone rang. It was Derek. "V," he said, his voice tense. "You need to come down to the station. It's happening." Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Mills is here," Derek said, his tone grim. "He's making a public scene. He's demanding that I be put on leave for abuse of power, and he's got a few of his buddies backing him up." Vanessa's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment everything had been leading up to. "I'm on my way," she said, grabbing her keys. By the time she arrived at the station, the tension was palpable. Officers were gathered in the lobby, their faces a mix of confusion, anger, and uncertainty. Mills was standing in the center of the room, his voice raised as he made wild accusations against Derek, claiming that the police chief had assaulted him and was using his position to protect his sister's criminal activities. Vanessa pushed through the crowd, her eyes locking on Mills. His face twisted into a sneer when he saw her, but she didn't flinch. She had come too far to back down now. "You think you can get away with this?" Mills spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think just because your brother's the chief you're untouchable? Well, not anymore." Vanessa didn't respond. Instead, she turned to Derek, who was standing tall and composed despite the chaos around him. His presence alone commanded respect, and it was clear that not everyone in the room was buying into Mills' narrative. "This is what you've been waiting for, isn't it?" Derek said calmly, his voice carrying through the room. "An excuse to tear me down, to tear us down. But you've overplayed your hand, Mills." Mills' face reddened, but before he could respond, Lisa stepped forward, holding up a folder of documents. "We have evidence," she said, her voice clear and authoritative. "Evidence of Mills' misconduct, complaints that have been buried for years, and now they're going to see the light of day." The room went silent as Lisa handed the folder to one of the officers. Mills' sneer faltered, his bravado slipping as the weight of the moment sank in. "You're done," Mills Derek said, his voice steady. "You've abused your power for too long, and now it's over." For a moment Mills stood frozen, his face pale as the reality of the situation hit him. The crowd around them shifted, the tide of support turning in Derek's favor as the officers began to realize the truth. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Mills, once so sure of his authority, now stood alone. Vanessa felt a surge of relief and victory wash over her. It wasn't over yet, there were still battles to fight, still justice to be served, but this was the moment they had been waiting for. Mills had finally been exposed for what he was, and now there was no going back. The weight of the confrontation lingered in the air, but the station had gone quiet, the tension slowly ebbing away as reality began to sink in for everyone. Mills, now pale and shaken, stood alone in the center of the room, his arrogance shattered. His desperate attempt to tear down Derek and Vanessa had backfired spectacularly. He had played his last card, and now he had nothing left but the consequences of his actions. The officers around them, many of whom had stood unsure just moments before, were now seeing the truth. They exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others stepping back from Mills, distancing themselves from the chaos he had tried to create. The once loyal few who had backed him up now seemed to falter, realizing that standing by Mills could cost them their careers. Vanessa felt a strange mix of emotions surge through her: relief, triumph, but also a deep, lingering sadness. This battle had been won, but it wasn't the kind of victory that brought celebration. There was no joy in seeing the truth of the system laid bare, no satisfaction in watching a man like Mills crumble under the weight of his own corruption. What had happened was necessary, but it was also a stark reminder of the world they lived in, a world where people like Mills had power, and it took everything to bring them down. Derek stood beside her, his face impassive but his shoulders tense. Vanessa could tell that even though they had come out on top today, the toll of this fight weighed heavily on him. He had spent years building his career, rising through the ranks to become chief, but this battle had forced him to expose the darker undercurrents within his own department. It was a painful, necessary truth to confront, and now Derek would have to pick up the pieces. Lisa, ever calm and composed, stepped forward to formally present the evidence to the precinct's Internal Affairs Division. The folder she handed over contained years of buried complaints, allegations of misconduct that Mills had managed to escape from until now. Vanessa watched as the officers from Internal Affairs took the folder, flipping through the pages with serious, somber expressions. "Thank you for your cooperation," one of the officers said, glancing between Derek, Vanessa, and Lisa. "We'll be conducting a full investigation into Mills and his conduct. Effective immediately, Officer Mills is suspended pending the outcome of that investigation." The room seemed to collectively exhale as the words were spoken. Vanessa felt the weight lift from her shoulders, though she knew that this was just the beginning of the process. Mills' suspension was a start, but the fight wasn't over yet. There would be inquiries, hearings, and more battles to face before Mills was held fully accountable for everything he had done. But for now, they had won a significant victory, and that was enough. Mills, who had been silently stewing, finally broke his silence. His voice was quieter now, the bravado gone, but there was still a trace of venom in his words. "This isn't over," he muttered, glaring at Derek and Vanessa. "You think you've won. But people like me don't just go down without a fight." Derek met Mills' gaze, his expression cold and unflinching. "It's over, Mills," he said, his voice steady. "You've had your time, and now it's done. Whatever happens next, you brought it on yourself." Mills' jaw clenched, but he said nothing more. His fate was sealed, and he knew it. With a final, defiant glare, he turned and stormed out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of his career. As the door slammed shut behind him, the atmosphere in the station seemed to shift again this time. A sense of relief settled over the room. The storm had passed, and now there was only the calm that followed. Vanessa let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She turned to Derek, who was already watching her with a small, weary smile. "You did it," he said softly, his voice filled with pride. Vanessa shook her head. "We did it," she corrected, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "I couldn't have done this without you, Derek." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze in return. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, V. But you're right, we did this together." Lisa, who had been standing to the side, approached them with a satisfied nod. "This is a good start," she said, her voice calm and measured as always. "Mills is suspended, and internal affairs will handle the rest. But we need to stay vigilant. There may be others who try to push back, especially now that Mills is out of the picture." Vanessa nodded. "I know," she said, her resolve firm. "But we'll be ready." There was a moment of silence between the three of them, the gravity of the situation still hanging in the air. Vanessa knew that they had won an important battle today, but it was also just one step in a much larger fight. The system that had protected Mills for so long wasn't going to change overnight. But today, they had made progress, and that was something to hold on to. Derek exhaled slowly, his shoulders finally relaxing as the tension left his body. "I'm proud of you, V," he said quietly. "You stood your ground. You didn't let him break you." Vanessa smiled, though her heart still felt heavy. "I had to," she said softly. "For me, for you, for everyone he's hurt." Derek nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "It's not over yet," he reminded her. "But we'll keep fighting." They stood there for a moment longer, the three of them united in their determination. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. It was the end of a long, difficult day, but it also felt like the beginning of something new, something better. Vanessa turned to Lisa, who was packing up her briefcase. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "For everything." Lisa smiled, a rare softness in her expression. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "You're my best friend. I'm always going to be here for you." Vanessa's heart swelled with gratitude. She knew she was lucky to have people like Lisa and Derek in her life, people who would stand by her no matter what. And as they left the station together, Stepping out into the cool evening air, she felt a sense of peace settle over her for the first time in days. This fight wasn't over. There were still battles to come, still challenges to face. But for now, Vanessa could breathe easy, knowing that she had taken a stand and refused to let fear or injustice win. As they walked down the steps of the precinct, Derek turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "What now?" he asked, his voice quiet but curious. Vanessa smiled, her eyes clear and determined. "Now," she said, "we keep going. We make sure Mills is held accountable. And then, we make sure this never happens again." Derek nodded, his face reflecting her determination. "We will." They walked away from the precinct, their footsteps steady and sure. Together, they had faced down a corrupt system, and together, they would continue to fight for justice. There was still so much work to be done, but for now they had won the first of many battles. And that was enough. For now.